Hi, in this lesson we're going to talk about purchase contracts, including the offer and acceptance and earnest money. When talking about purchase contracts, we can't forget the Louisiana Purchase when President Jefferson back in the early 1800s purchased the Louisiana Territory from France. What a deal that was. Well, most of your transactions are not going to be that big, I presume. And when we talk about purchase contracts, we have to understand that the purchase contract actually serves three purposes. The first is a copy of the buyer's offer. So commissioner's rules here in Arizona require that as soon as someone signs an agreement, they must be given a copy as soon as practicable. So give the buyer a copy of the offer once they sign it. The second purpose is once the seller signs and there's a full acceptance between the parties, it becomes a legally binding contract. And finally, it serves as escrow instructions. Sometimes people execute separate escrow instructions, but in most instances in Arizona, the purchase contract serves as the instructions to the escrow company. So let's talk about the status of that purchase contract. And let's start with a discussion of the offer. So an offer, by definition, is an invitation, typically by the buyer, offered to the seller to enter into a contract to purchase that property. So the buyer then is the offeror. Remember, OR always gives, EE always receives. So in the initial stages of a purchase contract, when a buyer makes that offer, that buyer is the offeror, the seller is the offeree. So that offer, remember, is an invitation to enter into a contract. Make a note for yourself. The offer is not, in and of itself, a contract to purchase the property. It's simply an offer, an invitation, a wish, if you would. And it states the buyer's terms, and that buyer, that offeror, can withdraw that offer at any time prior to the other party accepting it. So let's say, for example, that the buyer makes an offer on a property and gives the seller until midnight tomorrow to accept the offer. But after sleeping on it overnight, as buyers often do, the next morning the buyer decides that they don't want to purchase the property. They contact their agent. That agent now has a duty to contact the listing agent and withdraw that offer. At that particular point in time, the offer is dead. Please realize, commissioner's rules require, and good business practice, of course, requires, that all offers be presented. So sometimes there's a feeling by a buyer's agent that the listing agent may not actually be giving their offer similar treatment or similar standing as an offer that the listing agent might have or that some other agent might have. It's so important to remember that the listing agent typically is in control here, but the listing agent has a duty to the seller to make sure that all offers are presented. Not only do the commissioner's rules require that, but the fiduciary duty of disclosure to their seller client, I'm talking about the listing agent now, dictates that they keep the seller informed of any and all information. That includes, of course, all offers. And as we've said in a previous lesson, that would even include verbal offers. It's important to realize that when a licensee is acting as a principal, in other words, the licensee is the buyer making the offer, they must disclose that he or she is a licensed real estate agent. Conversely, if the seller is a licensee, that has to be disclosed in the purchase contract as well. So let's continue on in our offering process here. Let's say that the seller decides not to accept the offer as written, but wants to make some changes. Oftentimes that's price, terms, closing date, etc. So now a counteroffer is prepared by the listing agent on behalf of the seller. The seller now becomes the offeror in that counteroffer, the buyer the offeree. So let's take a look at the counteroffer. By definition, it's an offer made by the offeree back to the offeror, which modified that offeror's original offer. Any change is a counteroffer. Now, the original offeror, once a counteroffer is made, is no longer bound to the terms of the original offer. So let's say that a buyer made an offer for $200,000, and the seller looked at that and decided to make a counteroffer at $210,000. And that counteroffer was presented to the buyer, and the buyer said no deal. Well, the seller said, well, okay, then I'll take the $200,000. The seller would not just be able to sign that original offer and say, hey, we've got a deal. Because of the fact that the seller made the counteroffer, the buyer's original offer is null and void at that particular point in time. So, for a binding contract to actually exist, there must be not only an offer, but an acceptance and written communication of that acceptance back to the offeror. So let's go back to the simplest premise, and that is the buyer makes an offer, the seller then accepts that offer as written. Do we yet have a contract? The answer is, well, what we have to do is we have to get written acceptance and communication of that acceptance back to the offeror. So technically speaking, when the seller signs, we don't have a contract. It's not until the buyer receives written communication of that acceptance from the seller, through, of course, the buyer's agent, that we actually have a binding contract. So for acceptance and communication, once we have that acceptance and communication, we have a binding agreement. And the buyer is said to have equitable title. The buyer now has a contractual interest in this property. And this is important to understand. The buyer doesn't have an equity in the property. The buyer doesn't have what we'll define when we talk about deeds of trust as equitable title. But the buyer has a contractual arrangement, a contractual interest in that property. And that buyer, should problems arise, could actually tie that property up in litigation potentially for years to come. So it's so important that the parties understand that we're dealing with a binding contract to buy and sell a piece of real estate here. And this contract is binding on the heirs of either the buyer or the seller. Purchase contracts, remember, do not terminate at the death of either party. So let's say that the seller passed away prior to closing. The buyer could force the seller's estate to live up to their end of the agreement. Conversely, if the buyer passed away, their estate could be bound to live up to the contract to purchase the property. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, gee, what if the contract was contingent upon the buyer getting financing? Well, in that case, of course, if the buyer's death or one of the buyer's deaths would prevent them from qualifying, then of course the contract would not be upheld. But let's assume a simple situation. Cash and all contingencies have been satisfied. It's a couple of days before closing and the buyer passes away. The buyer's estate, assuming they have the funds to do it, could be bound to purchase that particular property. Now, purchase agreements are generally deemed to terminate if the property is condemned. In other words, the government exercises eminent domain or destroyed. In actual fact, if the property is condemned prior to the sale taking place, the buyer could say, well, look, I still want the property and I'll deal with the government. Or if the property was damaged substantially or destroyed in a fire or in a storm of some sort, the purchaser could still say, I want the property, and the purchase contract would be upheld. All right, but typically the buyer is not going to want the property in these circumstances. And for the purposes of the test, Basically, a purchase agreement terminates if the property is condemned or if it's destroyed. Now, in most purchase contracts, there's going to be some form of earnest money. So let's first of all define earnest money. Earnest money is money put into the transaction by the buyer to show that the buyer is earnest, is sincere in making the offer on the property. Now, most people think that the buyer sets the earnest money. That's certainly not true. The earnest money is just one of the terms and conditions in the contract, so that earnest money is really a negotiated item. It's negotiated between the buyer and the seller. If the price is acceptable to the seller, but maybe the earnest money is not, the seller has the right to make a counteroffer asking for more earnest money. And of course, it's not required in a transaction. I mean, it's pretty rare that we don't have earnest money, but this is not the consideration. The consideration is actually the price the buyer has offered and also the fact that they've reduced their agreement to writing. But as a listing agent, you always want to have a substantial amount of earnest money. This binds the buyer much more earnestly, if you would, to the transaction. And the buyer is much less likely to back out for no valid reason. But if they didn't have very much earnest money in the transaction, you could see how the buyer would say, well, go ahead, take my earnest money, I'm just not purchasing the property. And this earnest money is usually held and handled by the buyer's broker. The earnest money is deposited, as we'll see, in escrow typically, but it's done so by the buyer's broker when there is a final accepted contract. So in Arizona, what our statutes say is the form of earnest money must be stated. So when you have a purchase contract, is the earnest money going to be a personal check? Is it a cashier's check? Maybe the earnest money is actually not given to the buyer's agent at the time the offer is prepared. Maybe what happens is, since the buyer doesn't even have a checkbook, and many times today buyers don't have checkbooks any longer, so it may be that the earnest money will be deposited within 24 or 48 hours after the seller's acceptance. But the form of the earnest money and when it's to be deposited, in the case of a wire situation, needs to be stated in the contract. The salesperson's job, so your job as a salesperson, is to turn that earnest money over to your broker, what the statute says is promptly. In most instances, however, this broker will authorize the salesperson to hold on to that earnest money until such time as there is a binding agreement. So, what the law states also here in Arizona is that the broker must place the earnest money either in the broker's trust account or in escrow, a licensed escrow company here in the state of Arizona. And they're supposed to do that immediately unless otherwise agreed to by the parties in the contract. So let's take a few different possibilities here. First of all, if they did deposit the earnest money immediately, and by the way, that term immediately is generally thought to mean no later than the close of the next business day. But can you imagine a buyer making an offer? Let's say that they gave the agent $5,000 in earnest money, and the seller is out of town, and the negotiation goes back and forth over a period of many days. Should the broker be depositing that earnest money in escrow when we don't have an actual binding contract? Well, the way this is handled, the law says the broker should do that. But the way it's typically handled is the contract. A large majority of contract forms that are used out there specify that the earnest money will not be deposited until after there is a complete acceptance of the agreement by all parties. That way, the broker or the salesperson can hold on to the earnest money until such time as we have a binding contract. By the way, trust accounts are not required for earnest money. Now we'll see in another lesson that trust accounts are required for property management accounts. But for earnest money, what every broker that I know of, and brokers throughout the state do, is they have the buyer write the check to the escrow company. And that way the escrow company handles it and the broker does not have to maintain a trust account for earnest money. Now, of course, there can't be any commingling. Commingling of funds means mixing or mingling the client's funds with the broker's funds or the salesperson's funds. So sometimes it might seem easier. Let's say a salesperson is given $1,000 earnest money in cash, which, by the way, most brokerage firms don't want you to take cash. But let's say that the salesperson took cash, and rather than deposit it, because it was over the weekend, so what the salesperson does is actually just put it in her pocket and then writes a check to the escrow company for the $1,000 on Monday morning. That would be considered commingling. Or if the broker actually mixed or mingled, deposited that earnest money check in the broker's operating account, that would be commingling. Even though the broker or the salesperson didn't spend it, mixing or mingling money with the personal or business accounts of the broker or salesperson is deemed to be commingling. Another term you should know, and slightly different than commingling, is conversion. Conversion means you've actually gone out and spent that money. You've converted it to a nice dinner somewhere, or maybe a new car, however much earnest money there might have been. Now, if the contract is rescinded, in other words, if the parties agree to go their separate ways, the broker has to follow the seller's instructions here relating to the earnest money. The broker cannot just automatically keep a portion or the entire earnest money, feeling that they're owed that money as their commission. So remember, the broker has to follow the client's instructions in all of these circumstances. So that's our discussion on the offer and acceptance process and earnest money. In the next purchase contract lesson, we'll get into some of the clauses that are typically found in purchase contracts.